wanted to check it out. So we're going to share your name and your organization if you're comfortable, or if that's good for you. When you speak or when you chat in the chat, it's a great way to just build up our community here. And then tweet and post. We'd love to just continue this conversation on any platform that we can. And we're using the hashtags Freedom Cities and Just Transition. And then we'll have, basically the flow is going to be, we have these amazing folks that are joining us for this conversation. I'll say more about that. And then we're going to have some Q&A / comments. We're going to take a few minutes, actually like 3 to 5 minutes, to just get out a notebook or a piece of paper and draw or write, just like breathe into our own muscle of imagining what we need, like what do we think we need in terms of skills and resources and time and all of those things to breathe life into these visions and these things that we know are not just alternatives but imperatives that we need for our communities to be safe and healthy and thriving. So we'll do that, and then we'll come back and share some of that, and then we'll close it out. So that's the flow for the call. And then lastly, and I'll share a little bit more about how to do that. Oh, I guess to say that if you have questions, I think people are already using the chat bar awesomely, but just keep putting in your questions as we go along, because Amanda Aguilar-Shank from Freedom to Thrive is going to curate those and we'll help share those out. And then if you could put a little asterisk in front of your comment if you want to like say it directly to the group, then we'll know that and we can call on you more directly. We'd love to get more voices in. Y'all know the platform is not ideal for that. And then lastly, we're funding this in part through gift economics. And so I just want to shout out to all of y'all for contributing, whether it was $1 or $20, that's a way for us to pool our own resources and re-gift that back to the speakers who've been at this work for many decades, and often through just the work of love. So we're just excited to use that as a technology for this call as well. And with that, I'm going to dive in a little bit to just sharing some of the framing for this call. We're kind of excited to bring different worlds together for this call. So Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project has been working with the Climate Justice Alliance and grassroots groups, especially from communities that are on the front lines of fossil fuel industry, but also, as we know, Black and Brown communities are under attack, and Indigenous communities are under attack by so many fronts of this extractive economic system. And we often, because we're so under attack, we often end up in a defensive or responsive or reactive posture. And it's a really exciting period in which so many of our movements are shifting into a stance of, no, we actually need to build something different, right? We need to get ourselves out of this like hamster wheel and move to an entirely new way of organizing ourselves, of organizing our labor, of putting our love into regeneration instead of extraction. But we know that right now, a lot of the resources that we need to do that are concentrated and controlled in this system of extraction. And if someone maybe would share the link from, if you want to check out more about this Just Transition framework, that is a framework that the Climate Justice Alliance uses. We'll chat that in the link. You can download it. But basically, right, everything from water, seeds, soil, and even our stories, right, has been taken out of the web of life, and they are trying to increasingly put it into the chains of the market, right, including our peoples, our communities, our bodies. And that chain of the market is held together by two things. It's held together by a colonial mindset, right, white supremacy, all the stories that prop up this like idea of pull yourself up from your bootstraps, or it's a meritocracy, or, you know, the gender binaries and ableism. And it's also propped up by force, by criminalization, militarization, borders, right? And so it's critical that we must return ourselves, the water, our work, our love, right? Everything that we do to this web of life, which is much more about care and respect and meeting needs, the needs of human communities and the needs of the living world that supports us. But we can't use the master's tools to do this, right? So we have to use principles from the living world, not the destroyer world. And I'm going to just name some of those principles, and I hope that we can keep talking about these and keep imagining how they relate to the structures we're building in our movements. The first is boundaries, not borders. Yeah, and we know that in nature there are no hard borders, right? There's edges, and always there's life moving and transforming across those edges. But boundaries is a principle of the living world rather than borders. The second is dynamic balance. So there's no like always going to be this way, right? Things are always flowing and shifting. And if something's out of balance, that can be a huge, that can have a big impact. So social inequity is actually a form of ecological imbalance, and it's going to result in eroding the life support systems if one part of the system is starved while the other is propped up artificially, right? Like on other people's land and on other people's work. The third principle is zero waste. And it's a funny thing how this term has gotten used. But in the living world, there is no way, right? All waste is food. And when our people are feeding the prison industrial system or the detention centers or ICE, they're not able to bring their full, obviously, they're not able to bring their full, their gifts, their labor, their life force to work for a regenerative economy. And so we have to restore our peoples and our communities to a regenerative system. Zero waste also brings us that, the idea that what you feed grows. Fourth is mutually beneficial relationships and interdependence. It's a lot of what we're going to talk about on this panel. And then nature abhors a category. So just want to shout out that there is so much strength in diversity, but it's not the lip service kind of liberal diversity that we hear like bandied about, right? It's this kind of deep diversity that we see in living systems. And so I just want to assert that part of our work in this period is about restoring life support systems. And those take many, many forms, including the life support systems of addressing and transforming harm and hurting, but also the life support systems of letting the rivers run free and returning Indigenous sovereignty to all places. And then finally, the living world operates on nested cycles, networks, interconnected processes, webs, fractals, patterns, and scales in which everything is connected to everything else. Oh yeah, sorry, slow down. Yeah, everything is connected to everything else through diversity of scale, pace, process, organizational form, cycles, and relationships. So can we learn from this as we rebuild systems of care and well-being, including transformative justice and abolitionism? So the Groups in Freedom Cities, I feel very honored to be asked to just support facilitation of this call, because the groups that are working in this arena, including the Groups in Freedom Cities, are some of the folks just taking us where we need to go, right? Like really helping to lead our movements to decarcerate. And they're pushing not only for divestment and criminalization and incarceration, but also for where those resources need to move. And I want to just shout out a couple of campaigns, Safety Beyond Policing and Swipe It Forward, that Baji and the Million Hoodies folks are leading up, is working to move resources, right? The $97 million that is proposed for the city of New York to fund over 1,000 new cops and move that into mental health, housing, transportation justice, youth jobs, etc. That work, although there's been some rights, continuing to move forward. Jobs Not Jails, that's led by the Ella Baker Center right here in the Bay Area, or unceded Ohlone territory, is working to redirected actually $10 million away from the sheriff's budget and towards reentry programs in Alameda County. And then we have had an awesome coalition brought together in Portland around divestment, which was across the board, right? Divest from the Dakota Access Pipeline, from prisons, from militarization and fossil fuels, and under a broad coalition that was led by Freedom to Thrive, right? They succeeded in moving Portland to stop those investments and moving a reinvestment conversation forward. And there's been so many incredible movement and transformation within the movement to lead towards not just stopping with divestment and allowing those resources to keep flowing within this death spiral economy, but actually moving those resources into what we need. We just had recent victories over the last 2 weeks in LA with Dignity and Power Now, in Boston with the broad coalition there led by Ojima. And just want to shout out the incredible work that over decades folks have been really building to this moment. And so want to kind of transition. We know that we have to end systemic violence in these ways. And at the same time, we know that currently when shit goes down, whether it's in our movements, our organizations, our homes, or our communities, the tools of policing and punishment are still much more likely to be what folks resort to, right? Because it's what we've been taught. And it's still what's being resourced in massive quantities, which means it's been stolen from our communities and used to feed these policing and prisons and detention centers and militarization of our schools, of our communities. And so in the next hour, we want to just take this opportunity to dig into what would it take to really reorganize and reroute ourselves in liberated ways to address harm and hurting, and specifically get into what kind of resources are we talking about, and how do we move those resources from extraction to regeneration. Our speakers today bring this deep wisdom of both what has worked and also the questions, right? The edges that our movements have to be grappling with to embark on a just transition. I'm gonna not read whole bios, but I'm just gonna give a little, highlight of who we've got on the call today. And maybe Chloe, can you just spotlight people as I say their names? Yeah. So Miriam, this is Chloe Henson, who's with the Climate Justice Alliance and leading our tech for this call. Thanks, Chloe. And so Miriam Kaba is going to be our first speaker. I'm just going to say names first, and then I'll give a little brief intro. But Mariame Kaba, can we just show? I know there's so many people.
They're on the phone.
Oh, so. Right, on the phone. Okay, so Mariame, Mia Mingus is a writer, educator, and community organizer for disability justice and transformative justice. I'm going to let Mia say a little bit more about themselves in a minute. Xochitl Bervera is an organizer, lawyer, movement builder, teacher trainer, teacher of mine, and hey, Xochitl, and out in Atlanta. And then Nathan Shara.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, Nathan. And Nathan is a social justice therapist and educator who focuses on transforming the impacts of trauma and oppression, and just brings like decades of incredible wisdom born out of the work and teaching that Nathan's been involved in. And I'll let you introduce a little bit more of yourself in a minute. So those are going to be our 4 folks that are going to take it away in a minute. And yeah, as you can see, there's more bios that Pearl is chatting into the chat box, because these folks are fabulous. And we're gonna start, actually, I think I'm gonna start with you, Mia. If you'd be willing to just say a little bit more about yourself. I think everybody knows you because you are movement famous, but just say a little bit more about yourself and your background, and your gender pronouns. And would love to just kick it off with asking you to give us your definition of transformative justice.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Also, just in terms of gender pronouns, I use she and her, and you can go to the little 3 dots on your screen box of your image, and you can hit rename and put your pronouns in the video if you want. I have been doing social justice organizing, movement, activism, community building work for a very long time, my whole life it seems, almost. And I used to do a lot of work in reproductive justice work. I've done a lot of work in disability justice as well. I was lucky enough to be one of the small group of folks who helped to forward and create that framework and kind of give it name. Obviously, just because you name something doesn't mean you invented it. Disability justice work has been happening forever, just like transformative justice work. But in terms of giving name to that politic, I feel very honored to have been a part of that. And now I do transformative justice work, and I've been in that work for well over a decade now. And I started out doing that in Atlanta. And now I work with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and we are a community collective working to build and support transformative justice responses to child sexual abuse. Because child sexual abuse is bound up with all different forms of violence, and because of the world we currently live in, we end up working on all different types of intimate and sexual violence in particular. So everything from adult on adult violence, including rape and sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, etc. So I can talk about transformative justice a little bit, Michelle. So I feel like at its most basic, the way that I talk about it to just any person on the street is transformative justice is trying to figure out how do we respond to violence in a way that doesn't create more violence? How do we respond to harm in a way that doesn't create more harm? And we can also think about it as a way of getting in right relationship with each other. We can also think about it in terms of how do we transform violence, harm, and abuse. I also like to think about it as how do we respond to violence in ways that don't rely on the state, which we understand as sites and actors of violence. So the police, prisons, the criminal legal system, ICE, the foster care system, et cetera, et cetera. And how do we also not rely on systemic violence like vigilantism, everybody going and beating up somebody with a baseball bat, but also not reinforcing really oppressive norms as well. So not reinforcing oppressive gender norms, for example. So that's one piece of TJ, not relying on state systems / violence and systemic violence. But also, I think the most important part of transformative justice to me is that we're actively cultivating the very things that we know will help to prevent future acts of violence. So things like accountability, healing, safety for everyone involved, resilience. And we say everyone involved because we include folks who have done harm as well, because we know that those categories of survivor, bystander, and harmer, they're not always they're not always as neat, and they're not mutually exclusive. And most of us occupy all of them. Most of us have done harm or been complicit in harm. Most of us have survived harm, and most of us have witnessed harm and or been impacted by harm. Another key piece of that definition of TJ that I think is important is how do we meet immediate needs in a way that gets us closer to the world that we actually want and long for. So that could be with anything. It doesn't have to just be with harm and violence. But obviously, if you're responding to a sexual assault, for example, you would think, how do we meet these immediate needs? So maybe immediate needs of safety, maybe immediate needs of medical provision, maybe immediate needs of, connection and like a safe place to be. But then also, how do we do that in a way that gets us closer to our long-term goals of liberation and freedom and no prisons, no cops, et cetera, et cetera. And you can apply this, though, to anything. If you're having a fight with your partner or your bestie, how do I respond to this fight in a way that meets the immediate needs of this fight, but also gets me closer to the ultimate kind of relationship and love that I want to have with this person?
Awesome. Thank you. That is a beautiful, beautiful vision and practical vision. I want to move next to Mariame to ask you, well, to just introduce yourself, please. And also to just shout out how incredible, how much leadership Mariame has been providing as an organizer, educator, and curator of so many organizations, frameworks, practices, practical tools. So want to ask you to just give a little bit more about yourself and your preferred gender pronouns, and then also ask you to start us off, kind of builds on what Mia's naming about this first piece of transformative justice is about the role of the state. And so can you just talk more about abolitionism and define that for us, especially as it relates to TJ?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that I'm not on video, even with a blackened screen. I couldn't seem to connect audio-wise. My name is Miriam Kaba, as mentioned. I use she, her pronouns. And as was mentioned, I'm an organizer and an educator of long standing and have done work in racial, gender, and transformative justice over many decades now. I'm the founder and director of a grassroots organization called Project MIA. Our vision is to end youth incarceration. I've been part of co-founding several other organizations and projects over the years. And I'm also a co-organizer and co-founder of a project called the Just Practice Collaborative, which we just started a couple of years ago as a training and mentoring group that focuses on supporting a community of practitioners that want to try to address and support community-based accountability projects in the world of interpersonal violence. So it's a little bit about myself. I was asked to talk just now about abolition. And I think for me, it's actually pretty simple in terms of what I understand abolition to be. To me, it's a political vision. It's a structural analysis of oppression, and it is a practical organizing strategy. Usually when we're talking about abolition, we mean that we want to really end the entire system of mutually reinforcing relationships between surveillance, policing, the courts, and imprisonment that tend to maintain and expand social and economic inequalities and institutional and structural racism. So it's often, I think, probably more accurate to talk about PIC abolition rather than prison abolition, because it's not just about prisons or, it's about the whole entire mutually reinforcing set of relationships between all of the aspects that are institutions of death making, as I like to call them. I think it's also important to point out that when we're talking about abolition, we are talking about changing everything. We are not talking about changing one thing. Abolition is connected to people who are working for people to have living wages. It's connected to people who are doing climate justice work. It's connected to people who are doing education justice work. It's, all of those things are part of an abolitionist practice. If you are engaged in doing more justice and interrupting premature death. So I think that's important for people to get, to also highlight and think about. I think the last two things I would say is Ruthie Gilmore, who is an abolitionist, a longstanding and one of the co-founders of Critical Resistance, likes to say that abolition is not about absence, but about presence. So not about absence, but about presence. So a lot of times when people talk about abolition, people often will refer to the dismantling of a thing. And yes, that's part of the project. It's part of the political project and the ideological project and the organizing project. But the dismantling is not the thing. The thing is the presence. It's all of the different things we want to build in order to get us towards the horizon that we're trying to meet. I also like Benji Hart, who's a writer and a thinker, a young person out of Chicago, talks about the fact that abolition really teaches us to transform our reactions to individual traumatic events into codified political commitments. And so I really appreciate that way of thinking about things. And I like to say that abolition is not about your feelings. And I think some people will take, some umbrage at that. But I think it's important to say that because I want people to think about the structural analysis, to think about the political vision, to think about the ideology, and to think about the practical organizing strategy. Too often I would hear people say things like, as an abolitionist, I'm happy to see this person go to prison. Well, then you're not talking about abolition. You're talking about something else. And that's okay. You're allowed to have that vision and thought for yourself, and you can be in your feelings, and all that stuff is valid for you as an individual. But you're not allowed to make that into a theory and a practice and a way of thinking that has years and years and years of people's intellectual labor, physical labor, and their contributions to making this thing into a thing. You're not allowed to, subvert that or supersede that with your feelings. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and then Nathan, I have the honor, you're my teacher also through generative somatics, where I've been learning, I think a lot of us have been learning a lot about how we build containers of safety, dignity, and belonging, and would just love to hear a little bit more about your work, which is kind of at this nexus of the personal and the collective, which you talk about as really a key site for transformative justice. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what you're learning from those nested scales and how they relate to each other?
Happy to. Thanks, Michelle, and just great to see everyone on this call. Again, my name is Nathan. I use he and they, and I've been doing work really at that intersection Michelle named of personal and social transformation for, going on 15 years now. I really come out of doing anti-violence work within queer and trans communities of color and really have focused on, I think of it really as like the anatomy of power, and really being, especially over these last 10 years, in kind of deep healing waters with survivors of intimate violence, and then increasingly doing work with folks who have caused harm and are really moving towards accountability, and then also supporting communities and organizations and formations around folks in those multiple locations. A big part of what I think I'm really interested in is in that kind of just transitions framework, moving from extractive models of relationship to more regenerative models of relationship. And really, I think in being both in sort of therapeutic worlds and movement worlds, we've just inherited such a profound split between these conversations of either, I think as Mariame was saying, like being all focused on the feelings and like, do I feel safe or do I feel unsafe? And sometimes the politics and our actual rigor around our commitments and how we enact our vision shows up in kind of the, where the rubber meets the road, or being really focused on kind of large scale vision and impact in a way that doesn't always have room for the depth of healing or the depth of feeling that our relationships require to kind of stay current. And I think one of the big things that I've really been struck by in both being in kind of the deep one-on-one work and work with organizations, as well as trying to do capacity building around transformative justice, is this bigger question of how we've learned and been kind of shaped to numb ourselves, and how often abuse and harm are coming from a place, whether kind of greed or need, of not feeling for who's on the other side of mutual relationship, right? The mutuality getting kind of disappeared in trying to extract or get our need met, and that happening really inside of intimate relationship. And then also really we could look to the dynamics of oppression and privilege. And I think a big part of what somatic work and in kind of the one-on-one therapy healing space, I just see this ongoing tension of all the ways that capitalism and systems of oppression teach us to numb ourselves and not feel for the needs and concerns of who's on the other side. And I think what, I think it was Mia who said, right, whether it's with a friend or a sweetie, kind of going, how do I transform the dynamic of this conflict or this situation? So often there's such a long tail on the dynamics that show up of, well, I'm upset about this, but actually also this thing that happened last week and this thing that happened 3 years ago that we never got current on. And then the whole broader dynamics of race and class and ability and all of the power that we've been shaped into really makes it hard to be with an instance of harm. And I think in looking at scaling or looking at what are the lessons from individual work to collective work, some of what I really see over and over is there's a specificity to the ways that we experience and do harm. And often the more we start feeling ourselves, the more we start reflecting on where have I been harmed, where have I done harm, there's often a really clear trail of either apologies we haven't made, amends we haven't offered, or places where we experienced hurt and never got support or healing or even shared that happened. And I think the more we start to build our awareness and feel into what those kind of histories are that we're carrying, the more we open up the capacity for right action, which then if we look to broader groups of people turns into, I think, some of the big questions that folks are raising around reparations and how do we engage in much, much bigger scale acts of turning and facing our histories and really starting to account for the long, long histories that have put us in the kind of set of oppressive conditions that we're in now that make it almost impossible to just look, I mean, that do make it impossible, right? To look at any instance separate from all of that history. And I think to the kind of principles Michelle was naming of like mutual relationship and boundaries, not borders, it's like, in order to be able to be in more current time negotiations of accountability and mutual dignity, we need to be able to be in more equitable conditions that don't have such blood-soaked tails on them. And tail sounds minimizing, but really just the legacies that we're mired in make it so difficult. I appreciate so much in TJ conversations, you know, we say hurt people, and the more we start peeling back the layers of hurt go back so far, we can end up sometimes minimizing either the situation in front of us or becoming overwhelmed by the long history behind those things. And I think the more we can address and confront those broader dynamics, the more we get to live in that kind of current time of mutual safety, connection, and dignity. I'm going to pause there.
Thank you. Wow, yeah, that was very powerful. Yeah, and I feel like there's ways that does lead right into Xochitl, the work that you've been doing in Atlanta with this broad coalition, which Racial Justice Action Center is a leading part of, but Communities Over Cages, and really just would love for you to dig in a little bit more to the systems and what we're up against, but also how y'all are really putting vision at the center of that work and in engaging folks on the front lines of this system in imagining what's on the other side.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. It's great to be on this call and just to hear the voices before me. I'm Xochitl Bervera, and I am currently the director of the Racial Justice Action Center. We have two projects, Women on the Rise and the Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative. And just to give a little background on who I am, started life in Mexico City and very young moved to Western Massachusetts, where I grew up with my mom and sister. And then you left and spent chunks of time in New York, in Oakland, California, and in New Orleans before landing in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am now. So I have been living and loving and organizing in the South for over 15 years. And I've been a student and in more recent years, a teacher of somatics. Embodied leadership and transformation for going on 9 years. And in much of all of that time, and even in New York and in California, was really spent a lot of time kind of with this experiment of, you know, it should say, you know, I'm an organizer and I'm a campaigner. And really came up and have been trained in that in the kind of hard skills of running campaigns and impacting policy. And I think for a long time been playing with, when I say playing with, I really do mean just experimenting with what is it to be an abolitionist. And then it is one thing to know that it is a practical strategy, and then it is another to try to get it to the level at which we can actually wage a campaign or build a campaign where abolitionist vision can be in there, but we're like meeting the systems and structures as they are currently, which is such a far way off, right? So really thinking, how do we divest and dismantle, right, and debunk the myths and all of the pieces that have been mentioned, but then what does it actually mean to try to grab the resources by which the money, that's how, when you think of the institutions, their size, and then, you know, how much they become self-interested bureaucracies, right? Full of human labor, full of building bricks and mortar, full of funds and finances. Like, how might we destroy, dismantle what needs to go, and then capture what can come and be invested in our communities in real ways, right? In things that are, all the things that have been said already, things that create safety, dignity, and belonging in ways that actually would support our folks instead of destroy people. So I think, you know, in some ways that to me has been this like gap bridging, you know, and when I came up in organizing, there was a lot of really like delineation between people who are organizers and we're the ones who demand things from the state, and, you know, all of the inherent, you know, the reasons why that's the best strategy to have, and And then, you know, another group of folks who would say we're parallel institution building, and we're outside the system entirely trying to build things that, you know, replace or take care of in a real way the concerns of our people. And I think for me, there are actually times when I think those things absolutely are distinct and should be distinct. But there's maybe this growing like nuanced understanding of, are there ways that we can be engaged in demanding things from the state and getting our hands on very concrete resources that people desperately need, $32 million, for example, or giant buildings that sit in our neighborhoods, to capture those for the purposes of then community-led services, supports, processes. Can we do that? So I lead all that into say, just, I think the relevant background are part of our campaign, the Communities Over Cages, Close the Jail, ATL campaign was really built on a premise. There's a jail that was built in our city in 1996 when the Olympics were coming. The folks in the city actually called it the first completed project of the 1996 Olympics. They understood it was for the purpose of hiding the poor and the homeless during that time period. And they built 1,100 beds. It's been mostly between 500 and 600 people a night. Everyone in the city knows that it's the last stop for folks who are very poor, who are homeless, who are dealing with addiction or mental health issues. And this has been how the city has oriented to that for decades. When we began this campaign, our main focus has been to say we need to first starve the beast, stop feeding this jail. But most recently, when we launched, we said we need to capture the $32.5 million that go into operating this thing every year and bring it back to communities. And we need to repurpose the building and turn it into a center for wellness and freedom. And I think, you know, better to answer questions. So I'll just I'll leave it with this to say, in those demands, you know, the jail closures, I've been trying to close jails and prisons for many years. It's awesome. It needs to be done. It should be done. The piece of what it is to bring in visioning for what a repurposed facility could be, or like what redemption even might look like in a small scale, some of what Nathan was just referring to in the city of Atlanta, so that the ways in which this jail has been used to harm get actually acknowledged, apologized for, and then many, many millions invested, not just in the building itself, but in being a hub of wellness and freedom. I think that is the part of the campaign that we keep visioning towards, keep engaging community in, because we need to see a different way. We need to see a community-led process. But we think it is the both and. It's the divest, invest. It's the take from and dismantle and build up, and the connection between them that makes it so powerful.
Beautiful. Thank you. I would love to bring that back to Mia and Mariame. Just as we think about these questions of jumping from the how do we take the resources from the death spiral economy and move it, like Xochitl's talking about, but actually in ways that are deeply rooted in the values and what folks have been learning from these processes of community accountability, transformative justice. Mariame, I've been deeply impacted by what you've been putting out and naming around, that the question is not, it's not the right question to be asking, how do we scale this up? And we in the Climate Justice Alliance often say that to, the funders and the green economy people who are like, no, but that's not scalable. And we're like, yeah, the scale of the problem is the problem. We're not going to address it by replicating that. And at the same time, right now, it's a challenge, right, for folks in communities to figure out how and where to go to when we need support, right, when there's harm or hurting. So just love to hear a little bit more from the two of you, maybe Mariame first and then Mia, about systems, structures, organizational forms, like let's get into a little bit of the what are you playing with, dreaming of, what are some of the practical steps that support this building of this at the right kind of scale, or maybe nested scales. So Mariame.
Okay. Hi. Yeah. Sorry, I was muted, so I'm back. Yeah. So, I think we all have really different views. I'm interested to obviously hear where Mia comes down and where others come down. But I have found now over many years that I just think the people are asking the really wrong questions, for me at least, as it relates to transformative justice. The main thing is that it has become a thing where folks will often talk about transformative justice as an alternative to incarceration or an alternative to prison, or sometimes just the alternative to prison. And I just think that's ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous mainly because our whole point in talking about transformative justice is that one-size-fits-all models to address harm don't actually work, that the prison being offered as the solution to harms is actually ridiculous in and of itself, that we need multiple ways to address and transform harm, that, transformative justice is one framework, that some folks who have been trying for years to transform harms in our communities, in our spaces, in our families, have been employing various different kinds of tools under a transformative justice umbrella to try to transform those harms, right? But we need many different kinds of things, and we're going to need many different kinds of interventions. And so I reject kind of outright the alternative question and the alternative framing of this as a setup, basically, because it makes people begin to just think one way, and that's actually not what transformative justice is positing or offering at all. Very much focused on, decentralization, very much focused on non-expertise, very much focused on everybody in a cultural context figuring out stuff on your own in your ways that you can, learning from others, applying it, being experimental, failing a lot, coming back to, again after that failure, undeterred to fight for another day. That's what that is. It's a dynamic framework for action and interaction. So that's part of my frustration in the way that it's being posited now by people who often will say, if you're an abolitionist, then you must come up with a solution to harms that occur. Well, no, you actually don't, but it's good if you try. Nobody is you are allowed to make a critique of the current situation that we're under by saying, not this, those two words, Elizabeth Povinelli's provocation to us, that critique is okay. You can just say, not this, and that can be the end of the discussion. And many of us have taken not this and then have been experimenting and trying to find what else we can try in our context that makes sense. So I feel very committed to that. So the last thing I'll say about the scale issue is that I still don't really know what that means, because I don't see transformative justice work for me as not paid work. It never has been. I don't have a model for labor, a collective, an exchange that would allow a bartering system. Or I don't know what that looks like. I see me being in relationship with other people when I'm holding a process as all of us laboring together. the person who was harmed being willing to join, if that's the case, the person who did the harm being willing to engage, me as somebody who's facilitating being willing to engage, bystanders in the community and friends and loved ones and everybody else who comes into the process being willing to engage, all of us laboring hard in order to do that. So I just don't know what it looks like when funders want to, quote, fund that. I understand what it looks like to potentially fund people's training. I understand what it looks like to fund people or resource people's abilities to learn together. Like, that makes sense to me. The actual way of doing that is, like, the goal is to make sure everybody's engaged in addressing and transforming harm in all our communities all the time. And I guess what we can try to figure out how to scale up is skill building for that to happen. So that's my long, short answer.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm going to pass it over to Mia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Miriam, so much for all of that. I completely agree. I mean, there's so many things. I wish we had hours and hours for this call, because I feel like there's so many misconceptions about what transformative justice is and what it isn't, and also specifically what it will require of us. I think that there's this idea that that if we believe these certain beliefs, then we'll just all come together in this magical community response, and that is not what happens. And anyone who has tried to be part of a transformative justice process knows that that is not what happens. People don't show up, or they just show up for the first couple of weeks maybe, or maybe you're just 3 people together trying to figure out what to do who are actually committed to it. And I just want to be clear, like, when I'm talking about, different types of violence require different types of responses. And I think that's okay. And I just want to, like, piggyback and expand on what Miriam's saying in terms of, like, one size fits all. Like, it is okay for us to be different and to hold difference and embrace it. We still have a hard time just in general in our movements. I find that, we're going to be different all in the same way. Like, we don't really know how to hold and value difference. And so when it comes to violence, what I see is, for example, right now in this historical moment, is I see a lot of people taking a lot of the tools that were created for transformative justice in the context of intimate and sexual violence within our communities and trying to apply them carte blanche to state violence and state sanctioned violence. And we don't need to have compassion for the state, for example. Like, there are different types of violence, and it's okay that we have different responses, and it doesn't invalidate them because they are different. And I think that we can only get to that place when we really get clear of what our purpose and have clarity of our purpose, that our purpose is to end violence and ultimately towards liberation. Our purpose is not to just, like, do this instant gratification thing that will make me feel good in the moment, but then it won't actually end up getting us closer to the world that we actually long for. So I see that over and over again. And I say that also just from experience as someone who does a particular type of violence. Child sexual abuse, for example, requires different things and different kinds of responses and strategies and tactics than, say, violence between adults, for example, right? And some of that is because of the risk that we come up against the state. But I also want to be clear that, like, I feel like part of the problem, why we want this one size fits all, or why it's like, and it's not even just abolitionists. If you're any type of, progressive leaning, left leaning, radical leaning person, then you have to do TJ. And I just think that one, that sets us up for failure. But 2, we're not there yet. There's where we are and there's where we want to be. We are not where we want to be yet. Yeah, of course, we all want to live in a world where folks who have done harm proactively come forward without anyone asking them and being like, hey, yes, I'm slowing down. Thank you. We're not in that place yet where people who have done harm come forward on their own and say, I have done harm. What can I do? How can I make amends? Please, we're not there yet. And so I think that there's also a misunderstanding of, again, what transformative justice will require from us. And the BATJC, the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, I know it's really long, you all. Someday we'll have, like, a one-word name, like SHARE or something, but we're just not there yet. We focus a lot on skills building because I just also think that we love to dive into the crisis and the big things, like, you know, a rape will happen or intimate violence will happen, and we'll be like, everyone will show up for that, but no one will show up for the conflicts and all of the dynamics that led to that intimate violence, that led to that sexual assault. And so a lot of what we try to do in our work in the BATJC is be like, look, if we just put aside harm, violence, and abuse for right now, we don't even know how to handle conflict and misunderstandings well. We don't even know how to have breakups well. And I'm not just talking about romantic breakups. I'm talking about friendship breakups. I'm talking about organizational breakups. We don't know how to handle when things come up, even between us, when we have shared values, when we have shared relationship. I will give you an example. We did a communications workshop that was literally just, how do you listen and how do you share accountably? How do you listen actively? How do you share accountably? We got over 500 people who registered for that. People are so hungry. In May, we are going to have a how to give a good apology lab. We are expecting that we will have hundreds of people that register for that. If you're in the Bay Area, sign up for our email list. That is where it's going to go out first. And because we've had so many people signing up for these basic skills buildings, we don't even have to put these things out publicly. It fills up immediately from our listserv within an hour. So I just want to give us some perspective on this conversation, because I think that everyone wants to jump to, what do we do about harm? Okay, what do we do about violence? When most of us, everyone in the world probably has relationships that we have to work on right now that are not at a level of harm or full-blown violence maybe, but most of us on this call, even all of the many hundreds of people who are calling in, we probably have someone that we need to make amends with. We probably have somebody that we need to apologize to. We probably have something that we need to take accountability for. And again, I really stress integrity in TJ work, because I'm like, we can't ask people to do things that we're not willing to do. So how are we taking accountability? How are we navigating what accountability and responsibility look like between us? How do we do that? So I did want to quickly talk about just one specific concrete thing that we're doing, that because I also think that TJ can become very kind of ambiguous, and the vision and the concept is amazing and compelling, but then people are like, well, what the hell does that actually mean though? Like, what does the work look like? So one of the things that we do in the BATJC is we have a model of pods that just kind of came out as we were doing the work. We created what we needed with what we had. And so your pod are the people that you would call on or turn to if you were experiencing violence or crisis. Everybody has somebody, well, that's not true. Most everybody has at least somebody that they might turn to. So we created this idea of pods to name the specific kind of relationship within transformative justice, that your pod people may not be your closest people. They may not be your besties, your partner. They may not be the people that you party with or that you like spend your social time with, because also when we're talking about intimate and sexual violence, your closest people, that's oftentimes where the violence is coming from. But your pod people are the people that for whatever reason you feel some kind of relationship and trust to turn to them around violence. So everyone can go to our website. You can download our pod mapping worksheet. You can also read our pod write-up. And one thing that I would encourage every single person on this call is to figure out who are your pod people. Have conversations with them. Get consent. And you might have multiple pods. You might have people that you turn to if you were surviving violence, and those people might be different than the people that you turn to if you were trying to take accountability for violence or harm that you've done or harm that you might do. And again, they might be different than people you turn to if you witnessed violence. But as we start to build out and deepen and expand our pods, this to us is one of the foundational pieces of TJ, because we don't want it to be that everybody calls the BATJC when something happens. God, no, please, please. We cannot even handle all the calls that we get. And so we want to figure out, how do we build community infrastructure in our own communities and intimate networks? And pods is a beginning way to do that. Another way is something that we're building towards in 3 to 5 years, is to have a network of intervention pods in the Bay Area where people come in and they get trained for like a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And they are then intervention pods that we can activate around the Bay Area. When we get calls that maybe we can't handle, then we send it out to these pods, or maybe they can start getting calls too. But just thinking about what actual concrete community infrastructure looks like. What if we had a network of safe houses where folks who were fleeing harm could go to, or where folks who have done harm can go to, where maybe we need to remove someone from a situation. Doesn't mean we want to lock them in a cage, but it means that maybe they do need to be removed from a situation for a time. And maybe there are also safe houses that have signed on and, you know, have competency in knowing how to do that. And I just want to close with this last thing, which is like, for me, one thing that I think about all the time is, if we can't handle the small things between us, how are we going to handle the big things between us? So I know that a lot of us, we're crisis junkies, right? We know how to like get out on the street if a protest is needed. We know how to get to the, you know, to the courts if something is going down. But we oftentimes don't know how to show up for ourselves. We don't know how to show up for the people closest to us, or the people closest to us don't call us because they're like, you work too much and you're never available. You're always running a campaign. You're always doing something. So I also think that we need to shift how we understand transformative justice and how we understand what it's actually going to take to transform harm. Because real talk, it's not just skills building things like communication, learning how to run an accountability process, learning how to support survivors. Real talk, sometimes it's things like scheduling that are the hardest things. It's hard to schedule time with your friends who you want to see, let alone an intervention where we're trying to coordinate 12 people. So I'll stop there.
Woohoo! I feel like, yeah, like Xochitl said, I feel like we could, yeah, there's just so much depth here. Thank you, Mia and Miriam, for those last two pieces. I want to name that, like, yeah, I mean, Miriam, what you're naming about like, TJ is not in a vacuum, or even these processes are not in a vacuum, right? It's like the whole system is ass backwards and destructive and dirty, you know? And so the idea of just like taking out this one piece, which is, you know, the prison system or something, and trying to transform it in that kind of way. When so much of what we need for self-determination, all the things really, right? Land, housing, water, energy, even culture is like concentrated and controlled. And we were gonna do Q&A, but we had such juicy, like, yeah, it just has been really juicy to hear from you all, that we wanted to actually use this opportunity, since Mia, you kind of kicked us off into this piece of like, what are the resources that that we really need? And I don't mean that in terms of like just money or capital even, but to the point of like, there's skills, there's time, there's, you know, there is land and places to meet, there's, you know, our relationships and networks, and we'd love to just give people a couple minutes. Like, we feel like part of the intention of this series of calls is to support us all as organizers in building new muscle to exercise our like practical visionary tools, and some of that is like, the resources are they're always out of reach for us, or they feel like they're out of reach, you know, like Mia's talking about these like very basic building blocks of like, how do I say I'm sorry? I know you weren't talking to me because I've resolved everything. But yeah, those like very basic building blocks. And so we'd love to give people a few minutes just to like get out a piece of paper and draw or doodle or write. What are the resources we need to restore community accountability structures, right? Elders, time around the fire, land where children can run free, stretch your imagination, take a few minutes. We're going to time it. I'm going to say 3 minutes because I know there's such juicy things. We want to hear back from you too. So we'll come back in 3 minutes and just right away. Right. Right. Your last doodle or thoughts. Of course, you can come back to it at any time. .3 minutes goes fast. Take 30 before you go to bed tonight. Finish imagining for the day. And I'm going to turn it over to Pearl Bhatnagar from Freedom Cities, who's been an amazing driver of this call series and organizer of it all. Thanks, Pearl.
Thank you all. Appreciate all of your thoughts and the ways in which they've supported all of us in thinking through what some of these resources might be. And so we did want to open it up and hear more voices around what is it that you specifically in your community feel like you need support with right now. Sort of having an abundance mindset and figuring out how do we approach those things as we name them as deep needs. So just wanted to see if folks can type their names into the chat box and we can sort of stack comments and call on you. And a pro tip is maybe some of the questions that we didn't get to ask of our panelists. If you want to flip those around and name them, and also share what inquiries and what you're thinking. So again, type in your name into the chat box. Some of what I'm hearing around questions, and I'm going to turn into needs. Folks are saying that they would love curriculums or modeling interventions in early childhood, specifically how to raise kids without resorting to force or dominance. I know Nathan has worked with Generation 5 that's working to end child sexual abuse within 5 generations. So that's definitely a resource to look at. Folks are looking for sort of next steps on, they're at a point of sharing flyers of not to call the cops. It's like, what happens after that? what's the scaffolding of how to build in political education, and then also build out alternatives past telling someone, you know, not to do something. As Mariame said, abolition is not just the absence of, but what are we creating instead? Other needs and questions folks have are just, what are some really practical precedents or guides that have happened in really localized place-based areas around success or attempts at success of TJ processes across the country. And I would love to hear other folks' voices. Anyone on this list want to share? Mary from Southerners on New Ground says that one challenge is awakening the appetite for neighbors to want to get in folks' businesses and be supportive. Mary, if you want to share more, please let us know. Amy Carpenter shares that there's a need to figure out best tools to introduce the TJ conversation to a community affected by state violence. If there are any other thoughts, I'm just going to give folks a minute to either chat in their name so they can share some of those. But what we can definitely also do is, between us and the panelists, work on addressing some of these points, figuring out how to get you on Mia's listserv so you can have some of those tools to move forward, these basic building blocks, the fractals towards creating new systems to take care of each other. Michelle, I'm wondering if folks if the panelists want to respond or reflect based on what they've heard so far of what folks say that their needs are, or if the panelists have any closing thoughts too.
Yeah, that sounds great. Any closing thoughts? Xochitl, Nathan, Mia, Mariame, we can't see you, but feel free to just speak up.
This is Xochitl, and I'll just say it's been great. I actually I appreciate kind of all the questions and comments that are showing up, but also feel like the way that like these conversations can go. There's so much to talk about. There's so many things in the big projects, and then what Mia, I feel like just you raised so, you know, brilliantly is that the beginning of transformative justice conversations really have to do with how we are doing our own, and it's not to make it smaller, not to make it be like, oh, it's all about me. It's not like, oh, what am I doing in my personal life? It's like really understanding what we actually have impact on and how our impact multiplies. That going back to that scale question. And I just want to offer, because I've recently gotten into recovery, and there's a really, you know, famous, and of course, years ago, I thought it was like a cliche, the serenity prayer, right? That says, you know, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I feel like as organizers and as change makers, and many of us in the movement, we're so oriented toward having an impact on the big, huge institutions that need to change and shift. And that's amazing for vision. But what it can do sometimes is have us get really skewed about whether we are spending more time thinking about those massive things that take actually many things have to happen for them to be dismantled. But we sort of put it on ourselves and put it on our organizations that we are responsible for that. And in doing that, forget the place where we can be transformative, where we can be engaged, whether it's with our friend or our lover or the person that we harmed in an organization 5 years ago, or, you know, like just getting in right relationship and then helping to build the skills of what that is. For me, somatics has been a very, as taught through generative somatics, has just been a very practical set of tools that allow for a deeper understanding about what right relationship means, or what centered accountability means, or understanding and unpacking my own trauma enough so that I'm not bringing that and projecting that all over everybody when I think what I'm doing is having a good politic and demanding accountability. You know, these things are so core. And I just appreciate that, because I feel like the conversation got to spend a little more time there than than is usual. And for me, as someone who campaigns and spends a whole lot of time thinking about how many millions of dollars can we take from the state to do things, to integrate and to have that and to ask that question about whether I'm actually having the courage to change the things I can, which are so much closer in. That's all I got.
Thank you. Yeah, Nathan or Mia or Miriam?
Go for it, Nathan.
I can chime in for a moment. I think just kind of building off of what Xochitl was just saying, I really see one of the greatest thefts of oppression and trauma being the ways that they train us to pay attention to who has power over us, to try and navigate our safety or to understand what we'll be subjected to. And that kind of paying attention externally all of the time is such a huge cost in terms of knowing what we care about, what we feel, what we need, or even that things that are happening aren't working for us. And I think that process, and I'll echo Xochitl in saying that somatics has been a powerful path for me, and I really see it offer a lot, both to folks who have survived violence and folks who have, right, all of us in all the locations where we've caused harm. That process of also not getting so focused on trying to hold someone else accountable that we lose what the power that we can build or the relationships we can deepen or the safety that we can generate amongst ourselves that might actually allow us to make different moves that leave us less vulnerable to harm amongst sort of the people who are deepening through pods or through relationships. Really, that reclamation of our attention, especially in a moment when there's so many things vying for our attention and our attention is so monetized. I think that process of really cultivating our capacity to build and deepen and feel for, oh, right, I forgot to text that friend on their birthday, right? As small as that unit is, there is a weaving of depth and meaning that also becomes the resource we draw upon when we've acted in ways that are out of our integrity or experienced harm and need to be reaching out. So I'll just throw that in.
Thank you.
I can go. I think also the closing thought I would say is that if we don't want to use prisons and the police and the criminal legal system, etc., then it's kind of like that thing, like me, like then it is us. And I think that sometimes we don't make those connections, and it's like it's really easy to be like, no police, no prisons, and then to realize, well, who are those people going to be then? Who are those people that all of these folks are then going to call on? And especially if we include social services that get money from the state in that kind of like state analysis that we have. And so I want to name that, and then also just say that sometimes transformative justice can be about harm reduction. It doesn't have to be a full-blown, full intervention. Those are actually really hard to pull off. And that anytime we can be engaging in reducing harm and intervening and preventing or reducing harm, that to me is also part of what transformative justice is. And those are also, quote unquote, responses to violence. I think sometimes responses to violence is like this huge thing that we think of, that we're like, holy shit, I don't know how to do that. That's overwhelming. But if we understand responses to violence can also mean, intervening with your friend who's using misogynist language before they do misogynist violence, that can also be a response to violence as well. So I just wanted to throw that out as a closing thought.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Miriam. So I agree with what has been said already. I will just say that I think it's important for people to be willing to try things. To try things all the time. And it's not so important what you name it. It's more important that you are actually in the game in some way. And so that means that for some of us, it's, working with our kids directly and teaching them about consent and making sure that they understand that, we're always in reciprocal relationship with people. making sure that we're not making, the hard and fast distinctions between the good people and the bad people, understanding that everybody can be good and can be bad. So like really doing that inculcation at a young age around what you're talking about when we talk about the values of transformative justice. If that's where you operate the best, then please keep doing that, because as I think it was Mia who mentioned before, our current culture really doesn't encourage anybody to be accountable. I mean, what in our current culture would encourage you if you did anything wrong to say, yeah, I did it? There's just very little. And so if we have more of a culture that would actually welcome our taking accountability, the only way we can do that is to build it. I think the last thing I'll say is, again, I think it's important to stop positing one-size-fits-all models for addressing harms. And that means that we have to be willing to try different kinds of things. And we're not going to have answers to everything. And that's not so important, at least as I see it. I think we've got to ask ourselves the right questions. Because if we have the right questions, we're much more likely to get to the right results or the right answers that are going to work for us in our context. And I think there's a lot of pressure on people right now to respond. Yes, but to feel like they respond and have all the answers. And none of us have all the answers. We're all just trying to fucking figure it out, And you gotta have some compassion for that. Compassion for the fact that we are failing all the time. And that's like normal and human and what we should be expecting. And the most important thing is when we do fail, to figure out how we're going to respond to that failure in a way that doesn't keep that failure from keeping going over and over again. So I just want to give us permission, honestly, to, take some deep breaths, figure it out together, make lots of mistakes, and then come back again for more. So I hope people are willing to take that as a, as a charge moving forward. We need more people.
Yeah. Right on. Thank you all, beautiful panelists and folks also on the call doing incredible work and also chatting important noticings and callings. We are committed as the organizers to continue this conversation. We have a next webinar web call scheduled already on April 23rd at the same time, where we'll get into some of the other pieces that we think are critical to how we take back our peoples out of this death spiral system and put our hands, our hearts, our labor to work for the meeting of needs, right? Both of the land, of ourselves, of each other. So join us for that. Look out for the information coming up soon. And there's also going to be a web page with curated links and resources. So folks should look out for that. It'll be coming in your email if you joined this call, I believe, right? After this. Yeah, thanks, Pearl. And thanks, Pearl and Amanda, for curating that. And then, yeah, just want to shout out all of y'all for, I do really feel very inspired. I think we all felt very inspired by just the edges that folks continue to push. And also as Mariame said, like, it's not on, like, this system has been so incredibly good at just take and steal, and it's okay to say no more. Like, and that is a first step towards transforming our realities and the structures that we live in. I think the questions in the chat, like a lot of these last questions are about like, and how do we take this and translate it both language wise and also community by community. Like, folks have such different ways to talk about accountability, to talk about justice, all of these things. And that conversation is to be continued, and just excited to keep on building with folks. Is there anything else, Pearl or Amanda, that we need to say before we jump off?
Thank you, Michelle, for facilitating.
Cool. And thank you to the note takers and tech folks and everybody who chatted. And yeah, just big love. Yeah, shout out. Take care, everyone.